this talk this afternoon. I wanted to start first by welcoming you all here to hear Deepan talk about his experiences with statelessness, forced isolation, and crimmigration in Canada. We recognize, of course, that this event is taking place locally on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin peoples, in particular the Anishinabeg of Kittakin-Zibi. And I myself recognize that I am a white settler who is living and working on these lands. When we acknowledge the lands on which we are living and working, it's important that we recognize how that acknowledgement connects to the work that we are doing. And so for today, I want to recognize that the fact that we are sitting on, are located, at least for some of us, on the land of the stolen land of the Algonquin peoples, puts right in our face some of the core questions that we will be discussing this afternoon, including who decides who is welcome, who belongs and who doesn't, whose land this is in the first place, who has a right to be here and who does not. It also links to some of the other issues that we will be discussing today with regards to the massive overuse of incarceration in this country, the deplorable conditions in which we place people when we do incarcerate them, recognizing especially that this unevenly impacts racialized folks and most certainly Indigenous people in this country, who are the most overrepresented in our prison populations, and in particular Indigenous women who have recently reached the very egregious milestone of representing around 50% of the Canadian prison population. So our intention for today is to put our energies into understanding more about Deepan's case, but also understanding how Deepan's situation is not a singular or unique situation. In fact, one of the things that makes Deepan's case so important is that it has far-reaching consequences for these questions of belonging, of citizenship, of who is welcome and who isn't, and of under what conditions and in what contexts people's rights can be taken away from them. A lot of work has gone into organizing today's event, a lot of work behind the scenes. And so I want to take a moment to thank some of the people who have been involved. And if your name comes up, please give a wave to the crowd so that folks can acknowledge your work directly. So our amazing research assistants, Rooksy George, Manisha Logan, and Amber Miller, who have worked tirelessly and very quickly over the last 2 weeks to help us pull this event together, along with my colleague at U of O, João Veloso, and Daniel Cayley Doust, who is the engine behind Justice for Deepan. I'm very grateful for the administrative support that we've received from Heather Crooks and Sarah Cleary, as well as Tabitha Malouin at Carleton University. And we, of course, have some sponsors for whose support we are grateful, including the Faculty of Common Law at U of O, the Criminology Department at U of O, and at Carleton, the Institute for Political Economy, the Department of Law and Legal Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Human Rights Program, the Faculty of Public Affairs, and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And I also want to thank our panel for today. So we are lucky enough to have Deepan Budlakoti here with us free, which is fantastic, to speak to us about his experiences. And Deepan's talk will be bookended by comments from Senator Kim Pate, who's also going to serve as our moderator, and I will be turning the floor over to her shortly. And Senator Pate, we are so glad to have you with us. So thank you so much. As well as Alex Neve, who's the former director of, or former executive director of Amnesty Canada, and is currently now a senior fellow at U of O's School for Public and International Affairs, as well as an adjunct in human rights law at U of O and Dalhousie. So thank you, Alex, Kim, and Deepan, for all being here with us today. The last thing I wanted to mention is that this event is being recorded. So if for whatever reason you're not comfortable with that, we understand if you want to shut your cameras off, but otherwise you're more than welcome to keep your cameras on. We will hear from, as I said, Senator Pate, and then Deepan, and then Alex Neve, and then we will open the floor to questions. Our goal is to leave lots of time for folks to ask questions of our panel. So with all that being said, I'm very pleased to introduce Senator Kim Pate. Kim, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dawn. And thank you to the organizers, and thank you also to Deepan and Alex for allowing me the humbling honor and privilege of being a co-panelist with you today. I normally hail from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinabeg on the shores of the Kitchissippi, but I'm right now in Mi'kma'ki. And I'm actually in the Moncton airport, so I do apologize in advance. My plane will likely board before we're finished question and answer, so I will pass it back to your capable hands at that point, Dawn, if that's all right with you. So I know who you really want to hear from, and it's not me. And so, you know, my interest in what happened to Deepan, I don't say his case because it's really his life. The fact that someone who was born in Canada gets a gets a birth certificate in the province of Ontario, has parents who become citizens, and yet is rendered stateless himself is unconscionable in this day and age. And before his situation, I had only heard of one other person in exactly, well, not exactly, but a similar situation to his. And sadly, she's still wrestling with this issue as well. I have, though, known many folks who have come to the country as children, who as refugees or immigrants with people who are sponsored them, often family members or other guardians, but through obviously no fault of their own, sometimes end up in state care, and oftentimes don't even know they're not Canadian citizens until time that they are jettisoned from child welfare into either juvenile or adult detention, and then discover they don't have citizenship, but also discover that they're likely to be deported. The fact that we do this routinely in Canada has been, and I'll just put in a plug in for a bill that my colleague is sponsoring. Some of you know that I worked on a bill to basically not only prohibit the deportation of individuals who come to the country and who aren't awarded citizenship but are in the state control through child welfare, which means basically the parent becomes the state, and the state then neglects its obligation as a parent to provide for the child. And so that's the arguments we've made. I've argued that we should actually deem them to be the citizens. It's interesting that many of the lawyers who do immigration work and others have preferred to say at the very least make them not deportable, and feel that strategically that may be more beneficial. So you'll see a bill being spoken to probably within the next week by Senator Mobina Jaffer, because there are a number of us who group in the Senate according to interest issues, whether it's anti-racism, anti-poverty, and the like, climate issues. And one of the groups is immigration issues. And so that group of senators, I offered them this bill and said, you know, I will support whoever wants to sponsor it, but if someone else wants to sponsor it, so she will be doing that. So stay tuned for that. If that came through, it still, though, would not solve the situation. Well, it would solve the situation if we go with the strategy that we're recommending. It could solve part of what Deepan is facing, but not all of it. So without any further ado, I want to pass it over to you, Deepan. And if there are any issues. I'll try to figure out what to chat. And if there are any issues that come up that you want to bounce back to me, Don, or Deepan, or Alex, feel free to do that. Thank you. Over to you, Deepan.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panelists and everyone else that's partaking today in this event, and all the people in the background that assisted. I appreciate it. As you may all know, my name is Deepan Bolacati. I was born and raised in Canada. I had my Canadian passport, birth certificate, social insurance card. I was on my mother's Canadian passport, my own Canadian passport, and then a secondary renewal passport. Up until I was 20 years old, when I was held at Ottawa Detention Center, placed in segregation, a correctional officer stated and asked me the question, was I a citizen? Of course, I said I was a citizen. From moving forward, from that point, CBSA, Canada Border Service Agency, came and see me, stating that I'm not a citizen. The unilaterally took away my Canadian passport and said I was not a citizen, without even providing any due fair process or giving me any options, and downclassed me to PR status. As I went to the admissibility hearing, I was therefore now deemed no status in Canada. I filed a federal court application and a federal court appeal application seeking declaration of status. The federal court appeal has stated that because I did not apply to India, my application essentially got dismissed. Years later, I'm still stateless. United Nations in 2018, after Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Saskatchewan PLA filed an application to the Human Rights Committee, gave their decision stating that Canada is in violation of several international laws. Yet, Canada still to date has not rectified the issue, and I'm still stateless to this day. I want everyone to keep in mind that imagine one day you wake up, you have no identity, no IDs, and you're classified as stateless. It's like essentially your whole life has been stripped away from you, and your own country has essentially abandoned you. You don't have proper healthcare coverage. You need to now get a work permit. You need to get a permit to go to school. And if you don't have these permits, the recourse is for CBSAs to put you into detention. And when I say detention, I say this because three things I want to make it very clear. It's irrelevant if you have a record or not, or it's irrelevant if you are coming to Canada off a plane. You're essentially placed in detention center. There's no defined detention center for people that are dealing with immigration matters in Ottawa or in Ontario. And I find it very, I always say to myself, I'm shocked that a person like myself, a person of color, has a Canadian passport, birth certificate, and then all of a sudden taken away. And this was taken away during the time of the Harper government, tough agenda, essentially on deporting people, tough on crime agenda. Carrying on, I am now at a stage where I've been stateless for over 11 years at this stage, with no remedy in sight. I continuously have to file a work permit, different applications, federal court, yet I'm essentially in limbo. You cannot have a proper life when you have conditions for life. It's essentially, if people are familiar with the criminal system, it's essentially being on parole. You're on parole for the remainder of your life, and you're on conditions for the remainder of your life. And you have CBSA as your jailer or as the police watching you. And CBSA, there's no transparency or accountability on CBSA itself. So if they tell you that, for example, they want you to come in tomorrow, regardless if you have to go to work or not, if you have a work permit, if you don't go in, they'll breach you. And then in return, you'll be held in Ottawa, you'll be held at Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. From that point, you'd be seeing essentially a board member at the 48-hour mark, and then if denied release, again, the 7-day mark, and then again, denied the release every 30 days. For committing no offense at all, just by not following the CBSA conditions under IRPA essentially is like a bylaw act, not a criminal offense. I want to make that very clear. To date, there is no end in sight. We have a system in place where the government has recognized that people are stateless to Canada. Canada has signed on to reduction of statelessness under the international obligations. It's clearly established from China in 2019 from the Supreme Court in Canada that people that are essentially not deportable should not be on conditions indefinitely. Yet I'm essentially indefinitely on conditions for the remainder of my life. Once you're put in this position, you have a hard time essentially getting medical care, getting a job, moving on with your life, say having a partner, starting a family, things like this that you think that you would be able to do as you get older. You're not able to do this because you have multiple layers of restrictions. At any given time, CBS can be knocking on your door, or at any given time, you could be walking down the street and CBSA can pull you back in. And then in return, you're held in custody. Then you're in a situation where you would lose your apartment, you lose everything and start over again. It's a repetitive cycle based on the action of CBSA taking away my passport and saying I'm not a citizen. And I want to go back to that point based on the fact that the Liberal government and the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau has clearly said a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And our rights are supposed to be followed, we respect international law. Yet, the United Nations has stated that Canada is in violation of several different international obligations, and Canada has not responded to it since 2018. Being in indefinite detention essentially is a Section 7 issue because my liberties are essentially restricted indefinitely. I've always asked people to imagine that you wake up one day and now you can't go to the hospital, you can't go to school, you can't work unless you have written consent or written documentation from IRC. Another factor that people may not know is that when you're applying for a work permit or essentially applying for a work study, that can essentially take 4, 5, 6 months. The government puts you in a situation where you're not able to get social assistance and you can't work or you can't go to school. So they put you in a situation, you're put in a very vulnerable position where you are forced to learn how to survive without being able to legally work or legally do anything during those 5 or 6 months prior to a work permit. And I find it very interesting that they say that they support individuals and Canada is leading in terms of international rights and respects the Constitution, but people that are stateless are essentially in a very vulnerable position with multiple layers of issues that are not being resolved, and yet the government has done nothing to rectify this. You would think that the government would try to rectify my situation, especially after different organizations that have intervened as well as letters to the minister, but nothing has done. You would think that the Liberal government would essentially try to rectify my situation, yet they haven't to date. I want to say that being stateless, I don't even have words for it. I can't even define how a person would feel. I can say though that over the years, you lose your sense of humanity, you lose sense of feelings, you become more of, you put a lot of layers up essentially. So for me, myself, it's hard for me to be happy, it's hard for me to be sad. Even if it's a positive thing or a positive situation or a negative situation, I'm always neutral based on how my life has transpired being stateless. And then I want to go into being held in custody. Being held in custody at OCDC, living in a hallway that's 113 feet by 7 feet, held in a cell where you don't have a window, you sleep on a 2-inch mattress, you're in front of an open toilet, you eat your food on the floor, you could be in a cell with another individual or 3 individuals in total, including yourself. not having the ability to have fresh air, it gets to you psychologically. And being held at OCDC, you could be held on OCDC pending just immigration issues. It could be an individual waiting to go to the RO. It could be an individual that just arrived to Canada with no criminal record or no record at all, and all held on the same unit. There's no distinction being provided to your type of status. And I also want to acknowledge that while you're in OCDC or while you're incarcerated, your rights don't go out the window. But while incarcerated in the system that we have now here in Ontario, your rights do go out the window because there is no accountability or transparency process put in place to ensure that your international rights or your constitutional rights are actually being respected at OCDC. And then you have an arbitrary system where you have to see the Immigration and Refugee Board, the IRB, where you have the situation where you're seeing the 48 hours, the 7 days, and then 30 days. It's just appalling to say that we live in a society that doesn't recognize human beings as human beings once you go through those doors, through the wall, through the doors, or once you step into the process of dealing with immigration. Immigration, essentially being on conditions, essentially destroys people's lives. You have no sense of, per se, humanity, and you have no sense of moving forward. It's like you live life day by day, and no matter what, you don't know what's going to happen down the line. You cannot be stable. It psychologically gets to you. And then especially if you have medical concerns. If you have medical concerns, there's multiple layers. You can't get proper medical treatment when you're stateless because you don't have healthcare coverage. Of course, you can go there to the hospital if you're code 4. You have, for example, when you get burnt, you go to the hospital. That may happen, but if you have other issues, for example, if you need some corrective surgery, things of that nature, you would need to pay out of pocket.
All right, Omar, can I ask you to mute yourself, please?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Deepan.
Yep. And I'll close it off by just simply saying that I want people to, I would like people to essentially look at it in a way that if you had everything stripped away from you and you're born and raised in Canada, you had all the privileges as anyone else would have, and then all of a sudden a CBSA officer or a correctional officer and a CBSA officer tells you you're no longer a citizen, and then put it into limbo for the remainder of up to 12 years. And then yet our government has done nothing to actually rectify the situation. I would want to say that going through this whole process, I have a lot of doubts now, and I don't trust the system because there's a lot of systemic issues that have arisen in my own case. And I also look back at the Vavi Love case, where you have 2 individuals that don't have a criminal record and that are white. Go to federal court appeal, and get their citizenship back. The legal analysis, or I guess there's a clear nexus between my legal case in terms of my citizenship and the Vavi Love case, but yet there's a clear distinction between my case and their case, which I mentioned earlier. And I would find that, again, based on your skin color, based on your record, you're judged by societies, and not only by society, but also by judges that are supposed to be impartial. I also want to say that I always urge people to not look at individuals' criminal past or their past. Look at the fact that we're all human beings and we should be all treated with equal dignity and respect, not being judged by their past actions. Because at the end of the day, we're all human, regardless, all of us, and no one should not have no status, especially in a country like Canada. I'd like to pass the floor to Alex and Neve.
Great. Thank you very much, Deepan. And Alex, thank you for being here, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Kim, and thank you very much for that, Deepan, for sharing your experience, your long and ongoing experience with all of us. Let me start with one word: nationality. It's a word that we use regularly in many different contexts. But most of us, I would guess, never really give it a second thought when it comes to our own nationality. We were born with it, or we may have gained a second or even third nationality, maybe by moving to another country through ancestry or perhaps marriage. We're usually, not always, but we're usually proud of it. We enjoy it, we need it, and we may boast about it when we travel. We cheer for it during the Olympics, or this year, I guess, the World Cup. But we don't generally have reason to think about what it would be like not to have it or to lose it. I would say it's safe to assume that most of us on this call today, and most of us across the country, in many ways, take nationality for granted. It's just a given. But of course, nationality is absolutely fundamental. It provides our identity in both a formal legal way, but also in a very personal sense. And it matters so very much for that reason alone. But crucially, it is also the source of so many other essential rights. And I think we've heard that in Deepan's comments, and we cannot overlook that. Because through nationality, such rights as the right to vote, to participate and to serve in government, to travel freely, to be able to access fully education, medical care, employment, all of that connected with nationality. Critically, it certainly establishes that there is a government to whom we can turn for support and protection, sometimes in circumstances when life or death may be at stake. So it's absolutely bedrock. And that's why, going back to 1948, the right to a nationality is enshrined in Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's very simple, clear words. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Simple and clear, but that right is disregarded extensively. Clear statistics are difficult to compile, but around the world, far in excess of 10 million people have no nationality. Just think of that number for a moment. They are indeed stateless. Statelessness is, in many respects, a hidden human rights abuse. It's hidden by its very definition, as its victims lack the full legal protection of a state, are more vulnerable to exploitation and discrimination, and very often need to live in the shadows, in secrecy, and in silence. So that's the global context. What about Canada? Surely this doesn't happen in Canada. Well, you've just heard Deepan's deeply personal account of living here in this country his entire life. But for well over a decade of that life, he has been living the reality of statelessness. Stateless in the only country that he has ever called home. So Deepan's case starkly demonstrates that yes, statelessness can and does happen here. It happens in Canada, the land of immigrants, the land of welcoming refugees. Yet what has happened to Deepan shows us not only that there is statelessness in Canada, but that government decisions and government action can and do create that statelessness and make it happen. Particularly troubling as well in Deepan's case, and he referenced this, is the determined refusal of the Canadian government to take the steps now to ensure that his many years of statelessness are brought to an end and that he is able to enjoy his right to a nationality. Even more troubling because his case has been taken to the highest levels of the international human rights system, where Canada has been found wanting. And yet still, nothing changes. Close to 4 years ago now, the United Nations Human Rights Committee wrapped up an examination of Deepan's case. His case was in front of them for 5 years. This wasn't just an overnight review. And they concluded that Canada's refusal to provide him with Canadian nationality and to instead persist in fruitless efforts to deport him to India violates 3 provisions under one of the world's most important human rights treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Canada has been bound to uphold since 1976. The Human Rights Committee determined that Canada was in contravention of provisions in the covenant that safeguard the right to enter your own country. I'm going to come back to those 2 words in a minute, your own country, and the right to be with your family. And this wasn't just last week, last month, or even last year. This was back in August of 2018. One of the most important international human rights bodies calls out Canada for these rights violations. Yet here we are nearly 4 years later, and the committee's views and recommendation have been ignored by the Canadian government. Deepan remains stateless, and that risk of being deported to India continues, all in violation of international law. Deepan's story is in many respects unique, but that does not make the human rights implications any less clear or compelling. I won't go into his and his family's history. You've heard much of that from him. Many of you, I think, already knew about it. Clearly, the Canadian government continues to hold on to its insistence that when Deepan was born, his parents still had diplomatic status in Canada. And thus, despite his birth here, he does not qualify as a citizen. And somehow they consider that that therefore gives them permission to disregard and violate his rights. Deepan has demonstrated otherwise with convincing evidence. But is that what human rights are all about anyway? Should this actually come down to who wins a dispute about the timing of the end of an employment contract nearly 35 years ago? A dispute that at most is a difference of a few weeks or months. Notably, what we see from the UN Human Rights Committee ruling is that focusing on when Deepan's parents did or did not lose their diplomatic status is essentially irrelevant when it comes to human rights protection. And surely that's what needs to matter here. Because instead, the UN Human Rights Committee focuses on the whole of Deepan's life. 31 years of life at the time of their ruling, where he was born, where he has grown up, where he was educated, where his family resides, where his connections, language, and culture are strongest, where he has always called home. That mattered much more than the precise timing of the end of his parents' employment by Indian diplomats in 1987. And that is what led them to the conclusion that Canada is indeed Deepan's own country, under Article 12.4 of the Covenant, which reads, "No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter their own country." Deepan grew up Canadian. He and his parents took his Canadian status as a given, since he was born and raised here. At one point, after she had gained Canadian citizenship, his mother listed Deepan on her passport. When he was 14, he obtained his own Canadian passport. 2 passports. What could be clearer indication of nationality? Deepan has had troubles. He's had difficulties. He's had family conflict. He's had criminal convictions. That does not erase his human rights. That does not change who he is, nor where his home is. And I use that word home in every sense of the word. It does not override the fact that Canada is Deepan's own country, and it doesn't take away the reality that all that has gone wonderfully well, just as much as all that has been challenging for him, has been entirely about his life here in Canada, his own country, alongside Canadians, his own people. Now, Canada says that this was all a mistake. He should not have been allowed to live the first 22 years of his life under the belief that the country he had born in and the only country he had ever lived in was his own country. He should not, on 2 occasions, been issued a Canadian passport. That was all a mistake. They say that as if it was just an unfortunate administrative error, not callously playing around with someone's rights. The flip side, of course, is that the only other country that might recognize Deepan as its national, India, refuses to do so. He's therefore currently stateless. Well, this isn't just about bureaucracy and paperwork and rigid application of Canadian laws. as I've been reinforcing here, it's all about human rights. And in addition to the human rights protections I just took you through in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and which the Human Rights Committee has clearly found Canada has violated, there are also human rights obligations directly related to statelessness. There are two long-standing international treaties dealing with the rights of stateless persons, one of which, not both, but one of which, the UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, was ratified by Canada almost 45 years ago, back in 1978. The title of the convention makes it clear, doesn't it? It's like you don't even really need to read the treaty itself. The title sends the message. Canada should be avoiding and reducing statelessness, not creating and adding to statelessness. Article 1 of the convention obliges Canada to, quote, grant its nationality to a person born in its territory who would otherwise be stateless. That's Deepan's situation. That's Deepan's right. That is an obligation that Canada continues to ignore. Even though they both insist to the contrary, either Canada or India could act to reduce Deepan's statelessness and uphold his right to a nationality. But let us pause a moment and ask, which country has the stronger obligation and responsibility to do so? Is it the country where he has lived all of his life, where he speaks the language, where his family resides, where all of his friends, connections, and support are to be found, a country that twice has issued him a passport? Or is it a country with which he has no meaningful connections, does not speak the language, has no close family, friends, or support, and has visited only once in his entire life for just 2 weeks when he was 11 years old? Seems pretty clear, but Canada defiantly refuses to take the step of again recognizing him as Canadian. Instead, he is to be cast out. Over the years, Amnesty International has written to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration about Deepan's case. The response in one of their letters back was striking, as they noted that the government is, quote, committed to the fair and equitable application of Canada's immigration laws. Hard to see what is in the slightest either fair or equitable here. And do not be fooled into thinking that this is some sort of one-off aberration. Yes, the born in Canada, statelessness, diplomatic status dimension of Deepan's case may be somewhat unique, but Canada's enthusiasm for deporting people who have lived most, often virtually all of their life in Canada, when they run afoul of the law, is far too commonplace. And it's a practice that is rooted in discrimination, racism, and disregard for a range of other human rights. The impact of statelessness, of strict identity and exclusion, of a denial of rights, of being forced to live in the shadows, has understandably taken a toll on Deepan. How could it not? It does so on millions of stateless people around the world. That is why this is a human rights concern, and it's why it must have a human rights solution. The global numbers are deeply concerning. The UNHCR estimates that a child is born stateless somewhere in the world every 10 minutes. Surely Canada can take the right step, what I might call the human rights step, and turn back statelessness in at least this one case by restoring a nationality, Canadian nationality, to Deepan. Thanks, those are my comments.
Thanks so much, Alex, and Deepan, of course. And Kim, are you still with us? Okay, I'm going to assume that Senator Pate has stepped away for a minute. So I want to then open the floor to questions, comments. I also want to recognize that Daniel Cayley Doust is with us in the room, who, as I said earlier, is the the energy behind the Justice for Deepan campaign. And so Daniel, at some point you might want to chime in about different ways that folks can get involved, but certainly if you have questions about getting involved and how you can support Deepan, today is an opportune time to ask those questions. And I will also be putting up in the chat in a second an email address that you can send donations to, because as has been made very clear by all of the speakers' comments today, Deepan is in very difficult financial straits. And any and all financial contributions would be most welcome. This would go toward getting Deepan fed, housed, clothed, and supporting his ongoing legal battles, which you're all aware are not going to be ending anytime soon. So with all of that said, the floor is open to questions, and you can, oh, there's Senator Pate, and I'll turn it over to Senator Pate again to be to field the questions. And I'm not sure, Kim, if you had any wrap up comments that you wanted to make before we open to the Q&A.
Well, I'm wondering if Deepan had anything else he wanted to add, particularly in light of the very rich legal and conceptual framework that Alex has provided. And my apologies, every time someone tries to phone me, which we're getting inundated with them right now, is sometimes my phone blips off. So my apologies for going. I could hear you, but I couldn't figure out how to get you back. Everybody who knows me knows I'm also a techno twit. So if you're putting something, I'm going to try and see in the chat. But did you want to say anything further, Deepan, first?
No, I have nothing else to say at this time. Thank you.
Okay. So does anybody have any questions?
Two hands have been raised. One of them, maybe we can start with Deanna Deal.
Great. Go ahead, Deanna.
Hi. I had a question about Deepan had said something about so he was deemed stateless in Canada, and a reason that they gave was some application, or there was no application put through to India, or that he didn't follow up with an application to India. Anyway, I was wondering if you could be more clear about that, because I don't quite understand that dynamic.
Sure. So in the federal court appeal application, the judge's ruling essentially saying that I still had an avenue of applying to the Indian government. So from that decision from the federal court of appeal, I did apply to the Indian government, and they, through Freedom of Information, they confirmed that I'm not an Indian national and will not issue me any documents. In addition to this, 3 experts have stated that the timing in terms of getting a response is anywhere between 15 and 20 years to get a response. However, after that court decision, I did file an application in India, knowing that under Indian law, it's impossible for me to become an Indian national, rightfully so, as I'm born and raised in Canada and have been in Canada my entire life. I hope that answers that question and clarifies.
It did. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And of course, Kim and Alex, if you want to follow up on questions too, you should feel free to chime in.
I'll just add that it's beyond outrageous that Canada continues to hold, after years and years and years, we're not just talking about after a few months, but after years, continues to hold on to this way out there fiction that somehow India is going to see the light and agree that he's their own and welcome him back. It's disingenuous would be the polite word to use, but I think it's absolutely disgraceful.
maybe we can ask Sarah to ask her question next.
So thank you for speaking with us today, Deepan. I was just wondering, what circumstances contributed to your decision and perhaps the necessity that led to that decision to self-represent in your continued legal challenges? And also, from your experience self-representing, what steps do you think are most imminently critical that could be taken to ensure that inmates in similar positions to you would have better access to legal counsel?
So in terms of charter applications against the ministry, that was solely done based on the fact that there's no funding provided. If you wanted to advocate for your constitutional rights or your charter rights, you would need to do so by filing applications yourself. And in terms of self-representation, it's extremely difficult to self-represent while you're held in a detention center where you're essentially locked up 19.75 hours a day minimum every day and have limited access to resources to self-represent. In terms of providing guidance for other individuals, I would say that go in front of a SCJ judge and get court orders and get the ministry councils to be present to ensure that the jail is accountable to ensuring that you have the adequate resources to self-represent.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe we can go with a few of the questions in the chat. I can read the ones here that I see just to help Kim out, who's on her phone.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry. I'm trying to look at them, and plus I've got trifocals. And anyway, I'm old, so thank you very much for your help.
No worries. So the next question, maybe I can ask two or maybe three questions from the chat and go back to people, Deepan and whoever else wants to answer. So Holly Prepper asks, how does the state decide who is considered stateless? If he was raised here, how does the government have the authority to essentially get rid of him? Second question from Samantha. With what you stated earlier, is racism prominent in the correctional system, more specifically within the detention center? And thank you for sharing. And maybe the third one, and then we can go back to the hands raised after the answers from Madison. Thank you all for putting this session together. I was wondering if there is or has been any accountability at all in this case. If not, who exactly should this fall on?
Okay, so in regards to statelessness, it's essentially the government. The government can essentially unilaterally take away your status and then indirectly put you in a situation where you're stateless. They essentially have the full authority because the government is essentially that runs the country. In regards to systemic racism and racism in the system, I would say that it's a forefront. It's very prominent. It's essentially at OCDC, it depends on your skin color where you are placed. Essentially, you're primarily a person of color. You're primarily going to be held in maximum security, regardless of your charges. In addition to that, if you are on immigration detention, you're also going to be held in maximum security. And then in terms of accountability, I would say that there's no such thing as the state being accountable. It's the citizens of the state hold the state accountable for their inaction in my case and in other individuals' cases. That's how I would address that question. I'm not sure if Alex Neve or Kim Pate want to add on to any of those three questions.
With respect to the first question about who decides when someone is stateless, it's actually a very interesting question, and there's not a clear answer to that. I mean, statelessness is a state of being. You are stateless or you are not. I think what we see, and Deepan's case, I think, illustrates this well, is states trying to disregard statelessness or somehow pretend statelessness doesn't exist. Because, you know, I suppose seemingly a state, Canada, could, in a case, Deepan's case, tell him that he could and should try to apply for nationality from every country in the world before they are willing to accept that he is stateless. Now, I'm not suggesting that Canada's obviously going to go to those lengths, but I guess it kind of raises this question of, you know, where do you draw the line? Clearly, the line should well have been drawn in his case a long time ago, when it became very clear that the only reasonable country that might defeat statelessness here, India, is clearly not prepared to do so, and that should be the end of things. But here we are, on it goes. With respect to accountability, in terms of the kind of immigration, nationality, statelessness side of things, there's not good accountability there. There is the courts, which is maybe not so much about accountability, but trying to rectify Deepan's situation. Obviously, he has pursued many legal options over the years, trying to both gain status and to fight the deportation, without success so far. In terms of some individual accountability, you know, if there was reason to think that there's an official who has actually transgressed law in how they've handled Deepan's case, that's a much higher bar. I think it's much more difficult to pursue in cases where the allegation you're making against an official isn't about, you know, physical misconduct or violence of some sort. So I don't think it would be too likely to see that kind of individual accountability.
Thank you, Kim. Kim, do you have anything to add, or Deepan?
No, I think Alex covered it, and I agree. I mean, being part of the government now, it's a challenge when we're trying to actually address it through mechanisms. And, you know, you can only imagine the difficulty when it's, you know, someone in Deepan's situation, and those of us in this situation trying to get a law put in place to remedy these kinds of situations, can't even get that to move. So you know, we're in an incredibly privileged position. So I'm not suggesting it's in any way parallel, but it gives you some window into how challenging it is if we can't get the actual government on side to do it. And given how far we have swung in terms of the swing towards more punitive, hard-hearted approaches to all kinds of human rights issues, and as Deepan has pointed out, also some issues around the criminal legal system. I don't call it a justice system because there isn't anything really just about it. Those are huge challenges. And so I do think, I do have faith that we will move things. But in the meantime, people like Deepan and so many others have to suffer as we're churning through this incredibly laborious process. And as Alex has said, there are, you know, other issues internationally that we haven't even, you know, we haven't even wrestled with adequately. So, and I'm going to stay on as long as I can, but they're calling me to the gate, so I'm going to have to go on. And rather than make you all seasick by leaving my camera on, I will turn off, but I'll listen for as long as I can. So thank you very, very much for inviting me to be part of this. It was a privilege and an honor and a responsibility, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you.
And thank you, Senator Pate, so much for taking time out of your day and
please,
Kim.
Kim. I'm Kim.
I always waffle between being formal and informal. Thank you, Kim. It's always wonderful to hear your insights, and safe flight home.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's snowing in Ottawa, just so you know. Okay, Daniel, do you mind taking over moderating?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Awesome, thank you.
Maybe the next three questions can be the hands raised. So Selen, Jaro, and Jacqueline.
My question is, so we've been following actually along your situation since last year. And my question is, how has the healing journey been for you? how do you feel mentally, and how do you feel in the future? Like, how do you envision your future of healing?
Okay, so
Maybe you wait for the other, because there's a lot of questions, Deepan. Do you want to take note of that and we'll answer the, just ask 2 other questions? Does that work?
if we can go one by one, it'd be better for me. So we can just ask them
Okay, go for it, and then we'll go to Jao next. Go for it.
So essentially, I don't look at the future. I just live day by day, and overall, the system, the process, and all the legal system is very draining. It's like a full-time job and then a part-time job on the side. Essentially, I don't look at the future. I just look at day by day.
And if I can add to as part of the Justice for Deepan committee, like right now, there's basic needs are hard to cover. It's kind of a survival situation. So until that is kind of resolved, it's hard to think about too far ahead in the future. Let's put it that way. Jao?
Actually, it's just a quick comment, and I know it was addressed somehow already in the chat and by you and by Emily. It's about the Vavi Love case, and I think it's it's important to talk about that, and we're being recorded in the chat. It's not necessarily in the recording, and I think it's important to show how outrageous the situation is, as Alex said, because it's going over the year, and the Vavi Love case is from 2019. I think Deepan mentioned it quickly, and we're talking about quite similar situations that there was actually no doubt that the parents were working for foreign government, which was some of the issues that was key for Deepan's case, and arguably his parents were not, but like regardless that, like we have a Supreme Court case involving the kids of Russian spies that lost the citizenship and got back the citizenship. And not only about mentioning this case, but like for the students who were around, like they know Vavi Love more than Deepan. Like my colleagues are talking about Vavi Love like for 2 years nonstop. And even if we talk more and more about Deepan, like Deepan should be as known as Vavi Love, really. And it's frustrating, and it's outrageous that after this decision, the government is still not taking action in a case, not only a case in Deepan life. It's not only a case; it's his life.
And thank you for that, Joel. Appreciate that.
Thanks. Jacqueline, you want to ask your question?
Yes, I do. I just want to apologize for not having my camera on. Can you guys hear me?
It's a little choppy, but we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to apologize for not having my camera on. But I want to also thank Deepan for coming to our class once again, or this meeting. I really appreciate you always coming and expressing your experiences, although they're hard. I did want to ask, I know you just addressed it as soon as I sent it, you addressed my comment, but I do want to ask because I am also like of a minority community, and I know that like the justice system does treat us differently. So in that sense, I would like to know if you could just elaborate on like your experiences, and if you think that there's anything, how do you think the justice system can mend the problems that they have with this issue?
I think that's the question is very broad for me, because there's so many different issues in the justice system, from the immigration system to the criminal system to the justice system itself, and there's so many different layers. And then you also have the concept of systemic racism, as well as other systemic issues that are essentially across the board, and then the inability to access to justice in general. So in terms of, I would say that in general, I would say that a lot of steps would need to be taken to ensure that adequate resources are available regardless of your skin color, regardless of your status, and regardless of the money that you have or you may not have. And in addition to that, I think there should be additional steps also taken place to ensure that everyone's treated equally, regardless of anything else. Every single person should be treated equally, regardless of any kind of background, any kind of distinction that it's been defined, that it's stated in our society now and going back, is how I would answer it.
Right.
And if
So
I could,
I like, so sorry, I just wanted to kind of ask Deepan a follow-up if that's okay, or did you want to go first?
no, I was going to add to it, but you do your
Yeah.
follow-up first, and then maybe I'll
Okay.
add something at the end.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so Deepan, so I know that you've had a very not very good experience in the OCBC. So on an institution basis, do you think that there is a way that prisons can operate without biases and without discrimination and without like these hierarchies that constantly happen that are at the disadvantage of minority communities? Do you think that that is possible?
I would say that anything is possible. However, do I think it's realistic, and how prisons are operated in Ontario and how policies and standing orders are implemented, and then the lack of accountability and transparency? In my view right now, it's not possible. In the future, could it be possible? Absolutely. I think that a lot of steps would need to be taken, and different accountability steps would need to be taken, and then oversight would need to be consistent monitor to ensure that things are actually being followed. And then there's also the design and the concept of how prisons are in itself. Prisons should not be first resort as they are now, and also the condition itself has a factor that should be considered in terms of overall cost of how a person is being treated. I think
For
I don't know if
sure.
that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. I just because of my actual question, now that I have your attention, I'm so sorry everyone, I'm hogging him a little bit, but I'm so interested. So I did want to ask you, like, if you were of a different race or ethnicity, do you think that your experiences in general, in terms of statelessness, in terms of prison treatment, in terms of like how your life has panned out thus far, do you think that things would have changed? Or do you think that you wouldn't be in the stateless position, or you wouldn't be in the situation that you're in now?
I think that if my skin color was white,
Yeah.
everything would be much different than what it is now. I don't think that I would be stateless. I may have been stateless for a period of time, but not be stateless for such a long period of time. So I think skin color has a big factor in it.
For sure. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. Alex?
Just on that last point, I think there's no question that that's absolutely the case. If your last name was Smith and your parents had been diplomats from the United Kingdom living in Canada when this all happened, and then 20 years later things go a little bit rough for you, and you have a brush with the law, no one would even have thought to look into your immigration status. It wouldn't have even come up. So there's absolutely no question that the very genesis of how that whole fiasco around your statelessness began is all about your race. It's all about your skin color. It's all about what part of the world your parents come from. The other thing I wanted to say is just going back to a bit of the first question of, how can we move forward? What are some of the kinds of changes we need to see here? Both to address the kind of racist elements of Deepan's case and sort of the entire range of human rights concerns. I guess what I would really want everyone to take note of is how many violations of binding international human rights obligations are at the heart of Deepan's case. The Human Rights Committee found that Canada has violated 3 provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I've added to that, there's no question in my mind that Canada has also violated its obligation on the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. And one of the problems we have here is that at the end of the day, international human rights obligations mean next to nothing in Canada. They're not taken seriously. They have no clear enforceable legal standing within the country. They just kind of float out there as has been the case for 4 years since that UN human rights ruling for Deepan, as kind of nice words, but land nowhere and mean nothing. And there's a number of organizations which for quite a few years have been trying to do a lot of work to close that loophole. We often refer to it as Canada's human rights implementation gap. And we've just got to make progress about really coming up with new understandings of international human rights so that they actually have some teeth in Canada. And we don't, Deepan's case is by no means unique. There are so many international human rights rulings against Canada dealing with refugee protection, dealing with the rights of Indigenous peoples, dealing with women's equality, dealing with healthcare, all sorts of issues that are completely brushed to the side by governments because they have no obligation. We got to fix that.
Thanks, Alex. Pass the question asking to Steve.
Thank you. A member of my extended family has been without a work or study permit for about 20 years now. The government is convinced that he belongs to Liberia. Liberia doesn't believe he belongs to Liberia, so he's a stateless person in Canada without any permits at all. And I'm curious to know, Deepan, could you tell us more slowly, what permits have you needed over the years? And what permits have you been granted? And what permits have been refused? What kinds of permits?
So I have to apply for a unique permit called an open-end work permit. An open-end work permit allows me to work at a job, whichever job I choose. However, that permit itself has taken time. The first initial one took me over 9 months after filing a mandamus application in federal court. And then subsequently afterwards, anytime I apply for a permit, it takes anywhere between 4 to 6 months after the expiration of my work permit. So that is the only work permit that I apply for, because the work permit, the open-end work permit, allows me to study and allows me to work. Specifically titled open-end work permit.
Are you saying that there's a decision from the federal court on your mandamus?
No, the mandamus application was essentially to force the government to provide me the work permit expeditiously at that stage. And they conceded by just providing it. So there's no actual federal court decision.
Okay, you've done well. On the racism issue, let me just tell you that many years ago, Leclerc Penitentiary in Quebec had a range where everyone was placed who was not both French and white. If you were not white and French, you went to this range, and it was called the freak range, which is an indication of the attitude within the federal penitentiary system.
Yeah, terrible. Thanks, Steve. Next, Reach.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Deepan, for your talk. I'm glad to see that you're out, and I hope this situation, doesn't last any longer. I have a question, I guess, or a thought. I have a loved one who's in a similar situation to Deepan. Deepan actually knows him, and they were together at the OCDC for years. And with the difference that they came here as a refugee, as a child, and still have the refugee status, which the PBSA is trying to obviously revoke in order to deport, but this person is also stateless. And so I guess I've been kind of, I've been following Deepan's case for years, and I've been kind of on the side also dealing with this with my own family member and kind of seeing the ins and outs of it. And Deepan, I can't say that I understand what it is, but watching it also unfold in front of me, every day I relate to I can see the kinds of struggles that you're also going through, and honestly it's not a not a livable situation, and it's completely unjust. I wanted to ask a question about the possibility of of grouping people in this situation and what that could look like. Is there, because I'm seeing this being treated in an ad hoc basis by CBSA and by the government, right? As a case by case issue. There isn't a proper policy in place or a statelessness determination procedure or anything like that that would prevent this from being prolonged and being dealt with passively. Something like a class action suit or something to push towards a policy change. What are the options there? And so this is really what I wanted to know. Thank you.
I will defer that question to Alex Neve. You're muted.
Well, I think that's an interesting. Your reference to class action caught my attention, and I don't know as to whether anyone has given much thought to that, but that might be a kind of creative and innovative way. I mean, obviously in Deepan's situation, there's been lots of efforts to turn to the courts, to turn to advocacy, to turn to the United Nations with respect to his case on its own. There is some value, obviously, in bringing other cases together to get over that hurdle of somehow the misconception that this is a one-off, this doesn't really happen, it doesn't have all that much consequence or impact more broadly within Canada. So I think that's probably actually something worth considering.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you. I'll read a question or two in the chat. Just scrolling back up. I think the next one was IS or Elias. Oops, just lost it again. Sorry. So I guess the question is, what about the voice or role of Indigenous peoples, institutions, organizations on the question of statelessness in Canada? I don't know if Deepan or Alex would be the best person to answer this, but we've talked about that a little bit in the past, how it does affect some Indigenous people born in Canada, in so-called Canada. Deepan, Alex?
I would also defer this question to Alex.
I think it's a great question from two perspectives. One is what you've just hinted at, Danielle, in that because of the way the border is handled, etc., and where Indigenous peoples and territories rest, that issues around statelessness may come up directly for Indigenous peoples. But of course, the other side is the views from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governments as to who should or should not be stateless. What is belonging in Canada? What is own country in Canada? I myself actually don't know if there's been much commentary from Indigenous peoples, I'm thinking of legal scholars, et cetera, on that second piece, but that would be very rich and I think a very important contribution to this debate.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the question. Next question, we have time for a little bit more. Emma Rajala. Hi, all. Thank you for presenting today. I was wondering what role stigma surrounding statelessness, criminal justice interaction, or otherwise has played in Deepan's case. So stigma specifically linked to those issues.
I think that essentially there's always stigma based on having a record, based on being a person of color, and then having no status. There's always that in the background. I wouldn't know how to elaborate on that a little further, but I think that's always there and always will be there for the near future, from my view.
I think that's really important, and I think that word stigma is a very appropriate one to kind of label kind of the impact and consequences that we see play out in Deepan's case and so many others where there's this interface. You know, as I think a number of us have pointed out, this is a much broader concern where, you know, on grounds of criminality, boom, immigration's proceedings are launched against people who may not be stateless, may have another country, but a country they left at the age of 2. And they're now 33 years old, have lived here their entire life. But because of that stigma somehow of, you know, once you've run afoul of the law, you're no longer deserving, you're no longer belonging here, and are deserving of being cast out. Then all of this plays out. And that's from a human rights perspective. I think we're finally starting to make some headway. And even I think in the human rights world, it took quite a while to kind of pierce through that stigma and get real clarity around the fact that there are core human rights considerations that play here that you do not give up and lose because of a criminal offense. And I think partially that was even because, you know, for some human rights organizations, for human rights tribunals, etc., there was still a bit of that sense of stigma. I think we've made progress in large part in those human rights circles, but more broadly, it's still there.
If I can add quickly, like prospects for finding a job add different layers for criminal versus statelessness because you got a different type of work permit. There's also the political stigma. When we were under Harper, it was an automatic kind of no opening to any conversation and public kind of attacks from the government based on criminality. Not even to talk, without even talking about the immigration status part. And then again, it's considered to take any kind of political action on people with criminal records of specific kinds to be a bit of a political liability. We've seen that in our interactions with the Liberal government as well, more directly. I'd like to, before going back to Diana, there's Stacy, who's also a member of the Justice for Deepan Committee, who wanted to say a few words. Stacy, are you available? Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Sorry, I'm just walking a baby. Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks to so many people who are here. It's so great to see so many people and hear folks learning more about Dee's case. I'm a longtime friend and supporter of Deepan, and I just wanted to say, in addition to all of the wonderful and important, vital things that have been said by Dee and Alex and Kim, and the great questions, something that I always try to stress to my students, I'm also a professor in law and legal studies at Carleton, again, in addition to all the legal aspects of this case, is just how tenacious a person Deepan is, and how much this kind of a legal battle requires someone with tenacity, or socioeconomic status, of course. But if you don't have socioeconomic status, often cases we see that get to the Supreme Court are as a result of people who are just unrelenting. Because it's not just the legal battles, as everyone has heard today. It's survival every day. It's finding work permits, finding people that will employ you if you have a criminal record. It's finding places to stay when you have no income. It's everything is a workaround. Every single aspect of your life is a workaround and requires hustling. And again, that's also not to admonish others that don't make it, or to say that you have to be, or that you should have to be a superhuman to do this, to have this kind of challenge against the state. But it's an element that was not written about or not thought a lot about, but you see it in people like Deepan and people like Terry Jean Bedford and others who have really taken the state on. It's a full life's work. And I think it's really easy to forget that when we read cases or we, read about in the newspaper. It's like, oh yeah. But anyway, so I just wanted to really stress that both as a kind of pedagogical, like an educational point about law and legal struggle and fighting the state, but also as a kudos to Dee, who's just been fighting for so long on this. And, someone, myself and Daniel, and maybe some others on the call who heard the judge at his most recent case, was, sentencing, and this was criminal sentencing, who was applauding Deepan for his self-representation, his comportment in the courtroom, and who suggested that he apply to law school because of his capability. So that's all I wanted to say. And thanks again, everyone, for a great event. And thanks to Dawn and all the students for organizing.
I would love to have you in my class at law school, Deepan.
Excellent.
And I just want to tack on to what Stacey's saying, that Deepan has done a lot of this from a prison cell too, which is extra remarkable. And when Deepan and I were working on the testimony that I was giving in his case, like it's, at the whim of the guards when they're going to let him out and make a phone call. So it's not like, he's had the privilege to have unfettered access to the internet or a computer or even a phone while launching his own defense. So, Deepan, I've often said this to you, but really what you pulled off is astonishing. And if there's anyone who needs inspiration about the ability of one person to fight the system, you just have to look at Deepan. Because it really is incredible what that you've held on so long, Dee, and that you got yourself free. It's amazing.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Daniel, we probably have time for like maybe one more question, because I want to make sure that folks have a sense of what else they can do now that you're fired up and you see all of the injustices in the world. And I love Kim's comments about how we're not going to call it a criminal justice system. We're just going to call it I can't remember exactly what she said, but a criminal law system. So
there's
Daniel,
still plenty of interest, but yeah, that's fair.
Yes.
Deanna, do you want to let Jacqueline ask the question? Are you good with that?
Or actually, there's a question from Riss Smith
Williams.
Williams
You
in
can
the
ask
chat.
quickly, maybe two or three more questions back to back, and we'll work with what we've got. The question in the chat is, have you ever been interviewed or been used as a case study by a researcher, Deepan? And if so, how was that experience like? And then I'll just let Deanna and Jacqueline ask quickly their questions or make short comments, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
So in regards to interviews, I have been asked to do interviews. However, I don't fully know if my case was the main subject point of that interview.
There have been a few papers here and there, but it's a good question. How did you find that experience? I mean, it's just felt like an interview, like any other.
Any other interview is just like another interview, and I don't look at it as I don't take it as experience. I don't take it as a task I'm taking on. I take it as a point of survival, as a point of avocation, and a point of getting my case and my situation out there so people can see how messed up it really is, and showing how unjust the system is and how the system is treating other individuals in our country, essentially. Mainly focusing on the avocation aspect, not looking at it as another task, or not looking at it as an experience point of view, but more looking at it as survival and avocation.
Advocacy. Thanks. Jacqueline first, maybe.
I would like if Dina goes first, because I know her hand has been up for a while. Okay, cool. Yeah, so my question goes on like statelessness, because after hearing, obviously I know the textbook definition and whatnot, and I've learned about it in my law classes, including Dr. Moore's, but I never understood like the magnitude to which statelessness like is a problem. And I just want to know, like, how is that possible with institutions like the human rights organizations and the UN? Like, how, I just don't understand how statelessness is possible. So if you could, like, any of the leaders here, if you could just kind of like elaborate on that and tell me, like, how a person who, maybe if Deepan had a time machine and he was able to go back, how would he be able to avoid the situation? Like, if I know it seems like silly, but it's kind of mind-boggling to me, if I'm being honest here.
So in regards to the stateless aspect, there was no, even if I go back in time, I would not be able to change it based on the decision that CPSA and the government took when I was in custody at that time in 2009. In terms of statelessness and how the state is doing it, I want to highlight the fact that Canada is a signatory to the reduction of statelessness, and the fact that the government has put in new provisions under the Act, certain provisions around statelessness in 2018 and 2019. Yet people don't know, and even the UNHCR office here in Ottawa believes that no one's stateless in Canada. However, it's been shown again and again that there's individuals that are stateless. There are hundreds of individuals that are stateless in Canada to this day. It's just not shown. It's just really covered and not publicized, because people that are stateless are, well, all people that are stateless are vulnerable, but some people are more outspoken than others. And it also comes down to retaliation, essentially, right? The more you speak about certain things, the more difficult it becomes for that individual. You essentially put a target on your back. So there's always that fear aspect of other individuals as well. The more you speak up, the more you do things, the more maybe you become a target, because you're essentially bringing light to essentially the injustices that are happening. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but
yeah, but like, why I'm kind of unclear about the situation is for the fact that, like, you know, we have so many people advocating and like fighting back to this, right? So I just don't understand how it can still persist. You know, like you're saying that like the state has, you know, they have the power to do this, and they're like, oh, we don't do that, whatever, but they do, which is evident with you, right? So I'm just wondering, like, how it can be possible. I don't know if that's making sense, or
almost in a philosophical and political question, but
I will defer that question to Alex.
Well, maybe I'll say two things. First, a couple of extra comments on the sort of how can it be that we have statelessness at such a scale. I think it's important to realize, especially when we think of it in the global context, that there's kind of two ways in which statelessness arises. There's cases like Deepan's, you know, a very particular individual context that's tied to, you know, his birth and the status of his parents, and, you know, technicalities and disputes about Canadian law, etc. There's also, though, in many parts of the world, entire communities who are deemed stateless because of, it's colonial history, it's where borders were drawn, it's a country that secedes from or becomes independent from another country, and it's the Palestinian situation. So there's a whole host of situations, and I think that's part of why the numbers you may remember that at the beginning I was talking about well over 10 million people around the world being stateless. A lot of the big numbers come from those kinds of realities. There was a lot of statelessness that was created when the Soviet Union was broken up, for instance, and all the new borders and countries were sorted out, and some of that still persists in significant numbers. How it can continue, as you point out, given, you know, for heaven's sakes, we have international law here. The UNHCR is the international agency that is kind of entrusted with responsibility in a broad sense for stateless people. They're very concerned about it. They've, in the last few years, set it as one of their organizational priorities. They've had a major, I've forgotten what it was called. I think it was called I Belong or something like that. They had a major global campaign trying to draw attention to it, trying to build the pressure. on states to do something about it. I think, Jacqueline, what you very rightly are pointing to is kind of a broader question of how can we live in a world where international law is disregarded? And sadly, that's not unique to the situation of statelessness. And I guess I would just say, you know, all of us need to keep that broader imperative, you know, at the forefront for us in every way we can, of always conveying that message that these fundamental values and principles and obligations of international human rights, which are universal, apply to all of us and are in all of our interests, need to be respected, even though it feels so tough, even though we live in a world where we just look around and see states ignoring that all of the time. We just need to keep looking for ways to make sure our voices are very strong on that.
Thank you. And it loops back to political accountability for sure. And Deanna, last question, comment, and then I can wrap it up with the
Hi again. Thank you. So first I want to make just a really brief comment about the open-ended work permits. I mean, it's obviously not open-ended if you have to reapply every, 4 to 6 months. So I think that I just want to say that I think that that's fallacious in nature. Secondly, I want to mention, I know that the IFHP covers like healthcare. I'm concerned with healthcare. It applies to like asylum seekers throughout their process. I know that you're not an asylum seeker per se, but I mean, as a stateless person, deemed stateless, are you eligible for that coverage? Do you have any Medicare? Does your work permit offer some kind of Medicare coverage? I mean, I think that that's pertinent, right? I think that, yeah, anyway, maybe you can answer.
So twofold. One is that the work permit, the process is 4 to 6 months to obtain the work permit, essentially. And then when you need to renew, can also take up to 4 to 6 months after renewal. So, but the permits are issued for 1 year at a time. Second, in terms of the work permit, there's no process or accommodation or funding in terms of healthcare coverage. And then I have no healthcare coverage unless I apply for private insurance, and that's also limited at a cost around $3,000 per the year, which was done a few years back. And then in terms of the additional aspect of healthcare matters, I'm going to defer this question to Daniel.
Well, we're not actually sure yet if it applies to Deepan specifically for the interim federal health program, but there is someone who's looking into it. I think there is some sort of discretionary possibility, and I'm personally not super familiar with the coverage, but it does have some interesting coverage that if it does apply to Deepan could help out in the short term. Also point out that we did do extensive, like several years ago, I want to say in 2017 or 18, we did a bunch of, well, Deepan mostly and a few others did some tried to get OHIP, Ontario Health Insurance, to cover him, and went through a bunch of appeals and stuff, and they refused in the end. So we're still working on that. Same thing for the cost of medication, things like that. There's not that many options out there. If we look around through contacts, through community health centers, we can find, like, for example, like consultation services, but it's pretty limited and still on that front for sure. So that is one file that we're following up on. That's a good segue as well into maybe wrapping up that, like right now, as we
Can I just add one other very quick note on the question of healthcare? It's really worth noting that in 2018, the same year that the UN Human Rights Committee ruled in Deepan's case, they ruled in another case brought by another remarkably tenacious, amazing person, a woman named Nell Toussaint. And there's a ruling from the UN Human Rights Committee telling Canada that it contravenes the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to deny access to healthcare on the basis of immigration status. 4 years later, exactly the same result. Canada is ignoring and refusing to abide by that ruling.
That's interesting. Thanks, Alex.
I just want to say, I'm sorry to re-intervene. The reason I asked the question was because of the Toussaint case. So, yeah.
Great. Good to know. Yeah, so just to wrap it up, as the Justice for Deepan Committee, obviously we continue to work towards trying to get Deepan for Deepan to obtain his citizenship, Canadian citizenship. The next steps will include appealing to the minister directly, Minister of Immigration, on discretionary basis. We will be looking for organizational and probably endorsements from different political figures in the coming weeks and months. So if you have an interest or have an idea of a few organizations or things that you could help reach out to for like a letter of support of some sort that we can add to this application, feel free to contact justicefordeepan@gmail.com, which is also in the chat. And otherwise, we will also be looking, we're still working hard on just getting some financial support for Deepan's basic needs to be covered. So if you have ideas of how to fundraise or things like that in the short term, as we said, he's still a few months out of even being able to obtain a work permit. And then the second obstacle is actually finding work in the context, in his particular context. And then finding a place to live in a few months as well will be another obstacle or challenge, let's put it that way. On top of the healthcare stuff you mentioned that we're exploring options for as well. So short term, I would say those are the main things.
Thank you, Daniel. So just as a recap, if you have a little extra money that you can donate, Manisha and Ruxi have been giving you all the links in the chat. Financial support is desperately needed right now. If you know somebody who has affordable housing, a basement apartment, a granny suite, whatever, that they would be willing to rent out, reach out to Daniel, reach out to Deepan, reach out to myself or Stacy, let us know. If you know of anybody who would be willing to offer Deepan a job, same deal, let us know. We need to cast the net far and wide here in order to support Deepan so that he can be self-supporting, which is, I know, very much his ultimate goal. The recordings for today will be posted on the Justice for Deepan website. When, I don't know. If Kim is a technophobe, I am even worse than Kim at figuring out how technology works, but somehow magically that will happen, largely through the work of our amazing research assistant student team. So I wanted to close by thanking all of you for coming, recognizing also the work of many of the folks who are in this room who have done additional work behind the scenes, writing research papers and other legal documents in support of Deepan. So the students in my laws 5000, 6004 class, as well as my laws, my punishment and law class, have done amazing work behind the scenes, and there is more work to be done. So if you're interested in doing that kind of work, you can reach out to me as well. And finally, thank you to Alex and Daniel and Kim for offering your comments. And then my most heartfelt thank you to you, Deepan, for opening up your life, your experiences, your struggles, and sharing them with all of us, and then charging all of us with taking your story forward and making sure that everybody else, that the people around us, that as many people as we can reach, know about what's happening to you and how unjust it is. I'm reminded of the words of Madam Justice Louise Arbour, who talks about how rules might be everywhere, but the rule of law is often absent, and it most certainly is in Deepan's case. So let's bring the rule of law back here to reinstate Deepan as a Canadian citizen. Thank you all so much. If you are a member of the media and you want to ask questions directly to any of the panelists, we will keep the Zoom room open for a few minutes afterwards. Otherwise, I wish everybody a wonderful Friday afternoon and a restful weekend. Stay safe and well and strong and in the fight. Take care.